Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so that you know when live we go. Hello and welcome to RAU'S IAS DNS session. We are going to discuss today's newspaper, The Hindu, Delhi edition, dated 2nd June 2021. We shall pick up articles important for civil service examination and discuss them as per the demand of the exam. The articles that we are going to discuss are there on your screen, and the time stamping for the same has been given in the description section. This is the lead article from page number 6. Breaking the cycle of child labor is in India's hands. In this article, the author has noted that the true extent of the impact of COVID-19 on the child labor, of course, is yet to be measured, but empirically it can be said that the impact would be large. Because children are unable to attend the school and they are many a times finding it difficult to learn from the digital mode. And the parents, they are finding difficult to find the job. So the impact is going to be huge, and when we do the assessment, we'll come to know about it. But the author has said, and rightly so, that all the factors that contribute to child labor were not created during the pandemic. Most of the problems are systemic and they existed even before the COVID era. So let's try to examine those factors, and before that, let's first of all see what is the state of child labor globally and in India. Globally, as per the estimate of ILO and UNICEF, there are around 152 million children still working as child labor, and around half of them, they work in hazardous work area. There is a very good empirical number that the author has drawn out, which does not directly say about child labor but suggest. In the National Sample Survey report of 2017-18, it was suggested that 95% of children in the age group of 6 to 13 years are attending educational institutions, formal or informal. But for the age group of 14 to 17 years, this number drops from 95% to 79.6%. This difference of 15%, this large number of children, the author suggests, are vulnerable. They are facing some physical, psychological risk to healthy development, and hence they are prone to child labor. Chances are that many of them are involved in child labor. The exact official number, however, comes from the Census of India report 2011. According to the Census report of 2011, 10.1 million children are working in the age group of 5 to 14 years. And 80% of them are working in rural areas. And 60% around of child labor goes into agriculture. Remember this number. 60% of the child labor is absorbed in agriculture sector. Let us now see the acts and provisions that deals with child labor and how they define child and child labor. One of the main provisions concerning child labor in India is Child and Adolescent Labor Prohibition and Regulation Act 1986. This act has been amended in 2016. The act defines child as any person below the age of 14 years. And the act prohibits all form of employment of a child in any employment, including employment as domestic help. And person between the age of 14 and 18 years, they are termed as adolescent in the legislation. The act prohibits all form of employment for a child, but it allows some kind of employment for adolescent. But the employment should not be in hazardous occupation, like mining, work concerning inflammable substances and explosives, and any other hazardous process that has been defined in the Factories Act 1948. But since the amendment of 2016, the Act allows child labor in family or family enterprises. And the Act also liberally says that children can work after school hours or during vacations, where in family and in family enterprises. This is one of the major criticism of this legislation as was amended in 2016. Previously, we have seen that 60% of child labor goes into agriculture, and children working in the field can easily be considered to be working for the family or in the family enterprise. Then there will be many family enterprises in rural areas involved in some work like making of bidi, or making of pickles, or making of papad, or something like that. So a vast chunk of child labor involving sectors are foregone. They come out of the purview of this legislation. The definition of child labor, however, as given by India's Census 2001 office, is like this. Child labor is defined as participation of a child less than 17 years of age in any economically productive activity with or without compensation. The Factories Act 1948 prohibits any employment of children below the age of 14 years in any factory, but it does allow the employment of adolescents between 14 to 18. Technically, that's 15 to 18, just crossing 14. But the Factories Act imposes condition for the employment of adolescent as per who, when, and how long. As to who, when, and how long can the adolescent be employed in the factories. The Mines Act 1952 actually prohibits all sort of employment of children below 18 years of age in a mine because mine is considered as hazardous place of work. Interestingly, Article 24 also has a number to give, and that number is again 14. Article 24 says that no children below the age of 14 years shall be employed to work in any factory or mine or engaged in any other hazardous employment. That means factories and mines which are hazardous. Mines are absolutely hazardous. Those factories which are hazardous. Remember, Article 24 of Indian Constitution prohibits employment of children below the age of 14 years in any hazardous employment. The RTE Act of 2009 also gives free and compulsory education to children from 6 to 14 years of age group. We also have a national policy on child labor since 1987. And this policy also takes up the line of Article 24 of not employing any child below age of 14 years in any factory or mine or any other hazardous employment. So for the purpose of child labor, we have the definition of child as any person up till the age of 14 years. The definition of child labor, although, is a little vague and we do not have a clear-cut definition. If you follow the definition of India's Census 2001 office, then any sort of work, anywhere, in any economically productive activity with or without compensation, that should be considered as child labor. But according to the amended Child and Adolescent Labor Prohibition and Regulation Act 1986, as amended in 2016, children are allowed to work in family or family enterprises during vacation and after school hours. And the number of hours they can work after school hours, that also has not been specified. So this kind of labor done by children is not considered as child labor, according to Child Labor Prohibition Act of 1986. Now let's talk about causes of child labor. Certain causes are very intuitive, like for example, poverty. According to UNICEF, poverty is the biggest cause of child labor. You can think of other examples very easily, for example, dropping out of school. Once a child is dropped out of school, he obviously not has much to do but to get involved in economic activity. But the problem of child labor is systemic. It's very deep rooted in the economy, and the macroeconomic factors of the economy, they dictates the condition of child labor actually. See, a research was done by many economists in 5 Asian nations: India, Pakistan, Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia. It was observed that child labor is a major issue in all these 5 nations, and it is not a new one. Macroeconomic factors have been the decisive factor in child labor throughout the history. It has been documented and reported that factors like poverty and lack of availability of good education infrastructure, that explains child labor from supply side. But the growth of low-paying informal economy rather than higher-paying formal economy with higher labor rights causes the demand side of child labor. Look, you understand that India has rigid labor laws, and these rigid labor laws are touted to be responsible for the growth of unorganized sector in India. In the unorganized sector, the laborers are hired at lower wage. It's easy to hire them, it's easy to fire them. And in such scenario, children are easy fit as labor. They are willing to work for a lower wage. We have earlier noted that 60% of child labor goes into agriculture, and the majority of the rest of it goes into unorganized manufacturing, unorganized assembly units, unorganized trade. So the presence of informal economy actually becomes the breeding ground for growth of child labor. Similarly, after independence, India went for land distribution programs. Sometimes a well-intentioned step has some unintended consequence as well. Due to the land distribution program, the land plots became smaller. And the smaller plots, they are labor intensive. because it will be uneconomical to do mechanization on a smaller plot. So it requires a lot of labor, and that labor comes from family, and hence the children are made to be involved in agriculture. Similarly, if you look at the state of economy in India, it's mostly service-led economy. And the service units, especially the IT sector, they have not created jobs in the rural areas, in the poverty-stricken areas, which would have been done otherwise by the manufacturing units. So absence of balanced regional growth is a systemic reason for growth of child labor in India. But the good news is that situation concerning child labor has improved in India. Child labor in fact has decreased from the last decade. There are three initiatives of Government of India that has systemically improved the condition of child labor. One is MG Narega. MG Narega has ensured continuous employment in rural region of parents. So the push factor of poverty into child labor has been to a certain extent arrested. Another push factor of dropping out of school that has been taken care of by giving free and compulsory education to children between 6 and 14 by RTE Act. And yet another very important initiative of midday meal scheme has been considered as one important factor in retaining children at school. This gives education as well as nutrition to children. So the nutritional requirement burden on family has decreased, that has been shared with the government being provided at school. In 2017, Government of India also ratified International Labour Organization's Convention, Convention number 138 and Convention number 182. These two conventions are concerning commitment to the elimination of child labour. Also since 2017, Ministry of Labour and Employment is operating an online platform famously called as Pencil portal. Pencil here stands for Platform for Effective Enforcement for No Child Labour. The purpose of the portal is to act as a platform for close collaboration of government, law enforcement agencies, non-governmental organizations at center, state, and district and local levels for effective enforcement of child labor laws. This is the editorial article from page number 6, Tenuous Revival. See, recently, National Statistical Office has released a provisional estimate of national income for the year 2020-2021. According to the report, the Indian economy has suffered the worst form of economic recession for the first time in last 41 years since 1979-80. The report contains a lot of facts and figures which are unlikely to be asked in UPSC exam, but from the perspective of civil service examination, one needs to be aware of trends in various macroeconomic parameters, such as that of real GDP, nominal GDP, contribution of different components of GDP, contribution of different sectors, and so on. Further, since the economy has registered the worst form of economic recession for the first time in last 41 years, so that recession concept also becomes important. First of all, let's begin by understanding the twin shock that has come to Indian economy during the time of COVID-19 pandemic. Because of COVID-19 pandemic, there has been decline in investment. There has been decline in consumption as well. Why? Because there has been supply chain disruption that has decreased the investment. People has lost jobs that has decreased the consumption. Because of decrease in consumption, the profit margins of companies, the corporates have decreased. And that in turn has increased the NPAs of the banks. The financial health of banks and other financial institutions has deteriorated. And when that has happened, the banks are not ready to give credit to critical sectors like real estates and manufacturing. With less credit creation, of course, there again will be less investment. Less investment will result in less creation of job and less likelihood of increment of wage. That will in turn decrease the consumption and the cycle will go on. This has given a twin shock to the Indian economy. Situation decreased so much so that in the first quarter of the previous financial year, the economic growth was in negative. The GDP contracted in the first quarter of the previous financial year by 23.9%. And in the second quarter of the previous financial year, the contraction was by 7.5%. For the first time ever since we started releasing the GDP number quarter by quarter, since 1996, it has been for the first time that there has been first negative GDP growth and second negative GDP growth consecutively for 2 quarters. There has not been many instances after independence that we have registered negative GDP growth. The last time it happened was in 1979-80 when the oil shock was of the worst form. That has led to balance of payment crisis and GDP growth slumped by 5.2%. Prior to that, it happened in 1965-66 because of severe drought, and after that we started the concept of green revolution. Before that, for the first time that we had the negative GDP growth was in 1957-58. So prior to this COVID-19 pandemic, we had it 4 times. This was the 5th time. And this time we had quarter by quarter data. And we know that there has been negative GDP growth for 2 consecutive quarters. And that precisely is the definition of economic recession. Economic recession is defined as the fall in overall economic activity for 2 consecutive quarters. That means fall in the economic activity for continuously for 6 months. So by this definition, technically, Indian economy was under recession during the first and second quarter of last financial year. Now let's talk some very basic stuff. Gross domestic product, as you would know already, refers to the market value of all final goods and services produced within an economy. GDP basically means you are calculating the net worth of all final goods and services produced in the economy. If you take that in market value terms, then that is called as nominal GDP. Nominal GDP refers to the GDP at current market price, whatever the price be. You're taking that price of the good, that price of the service. And using that price, you calculate the net worth of all goods and services. That is nominal GDP. But in real GDP, you do not take the current price. You take the price that was there in a particular year. That particular year is called as the base year. So even though the prices of the goods have increased, but you don't take that price. You take the price which was prevailing in this particular year, the base year. So you take the price as same year on year. You don't change the price. But maybe the production has increased. So that will still increase the GDP. Because in this concept, the increase in price from the base year is considered as inflationary. So you understand that in real GDP, the prices are always attached to the base year. So the nominal GDP will of course be higher than real GDP if the economy is under inflation, if the prices are increasing. But if there is a deflationary condition in the economy, then the real GDP would be higher than the nominal GDP. The real GDP at constant price, taking 2011-12 as the base year, for the year 2021 was estimated by NSO at rupees 135 lakh crore. Although this is a decline from the previous financial year, where the GDP, real GDP, was 145 lakh crore. So the growth rate for the financial year 2020-21 was minus 7.3%. In the preceding year, it was 4%. Similarly, the nominal GDP calculation has been rupees 197 lakh crore. But in the preceding year, the nominal GDP was 203 lakh crore. That means the prices in the year 2020-21 decreased compared to 2019-20. Even the nominal GDP growth rate in the year 2020-21 was minus 3% compared to 7.8% in the preceding financial year. This is the trend of India's real GDP growth. As you can see, it has not consistently increased or consistently decreased. But you can see a sharp slump here. Prior to that, you see the slump in negative in 1979. Prior to that, in 1971. Prior to that, in 1965. Prior to that, in 1957. So GDP growth rate has been varying continuously, and it has been varying a lot. This is not the curve of GDP. This is the curve of GDP growth rate. And this curve that you see in orange, this is the 5-year moving average of GDP. But the one that you see in green, these are the GDP growth numbers. Let's see the trends in the components of the GDP. First of all, as you can see here, the major component of the Indian GDP is private final consumption expenditure. You must have heard and read that India is a domestic consumption driven economy, and that is around 60%, and that has by and large remained constant throughout. It has remained constant, quite constant for last 4-5 years, but it has decreased marginally in the last financial year. And you understand why. Consumption obviously has decreased in Indian economy. But if you talk about gross capital formation, which is a kind of reference for production of industrial goods, it's a kind of reference for inventories that the companies have. that has decreased. Gross capital formation has decreased. It has decreased considerably in last few years. It was 32% in 2018-19 and it has decreased to 27% in last financial year. But the point to be noted is it has decreased from 32 to 30 in the previous financial year. So from 2018-19 to 2019-20, it already decreased. And the pandemic has made it only worse. So India was already in trouble. So Indian economy was already contracting. The pandemic only aggravated it. There was systemic problem, as you can see. The drop in gross capital formation happened by 2% from 2018-19 to 2019-20. Gross fixed capital formation, the one you see in blue here, this is kind of investment. And this has increased in last few years. It rose from 12% to 14% in the previous financial year. And this increase from 12 to 14% is mostly on account of foreign portfolio investment within FDI. If we talk about sectoral contribution to GDP, agriculture and allied sector has more or less remained constant at around 17 to 18%. But in the previous financial year, it jumped to 20%. This is not because agriculture has done exceptionally well. It is only because other sector has underperformed more compared to agriculture. So its contribution has automatically increased. The industry sector contribution has been declining. In 2014-15, it was 30%, and it declined to 26% in the previous financial year. Within industrial sector, if we talk about manufacturing sector has declined from 17% in 14-15 to 15% in the last financial year. Now you have to interpret yourself whether this decline is a good thing or a bad thing. To compensate for the decline in industry, obviously there has to be increase in the contribution of service sector. The service sector has rose from 52% to 55% in 2019-20. But then you understand that certain service sector like tourism has been hit most because of pandemic. So there has been decline in the contribution of service sector in the last financial year. Within service sector, you must know that the highest contributors are financial sector, the real estate, and professional services sector. This is the lead article from page number 6. This article talks about a lot of things, but it talks about one very crucial thing very succinctly. It talks about indemnity that the vaccine manufacturers have been asking for, or liability waiver for the supply of vaccines. See, the issue is who will be held liable in case of complaint of any side effect of these vaccines. So the manufacturers are demanding that they should not be held liable. And this is the precondition that they are imposing on Indian government for the introduction of vaccines in India. And this precisely is the reason as to why they are not interested in engaging with state governments. You must be reading in newspaper that many state governments have opened up global tender. States like Jharkhand, Punjab, Odisha, but it all have been a non-starter. There is no taker of those tenders. Because these vaccine manufacturers, they think that this indemnity or the liability waiver that they are seeking, that can be effectively provided only by the central government. So they have very clearly said that they are interested in engaging only with the central government. So far the case was that the government included a liability clause in the contracts. Mostly all the contracts. So was the case in the contract for procuring vaccines. But according to section 124 of Indian Contract Act 1872, there could be a case of contract of indemnity. This contract of indemnity is a contract by which one party guarantees to save the other person from loss caused to him even by the guarantor himself or by the action of any other person. So the Indian Contract Act 1872 empowers the central government to provide indemnity. Legally, it can be done. And these wise people definitely know about it, and this is what they are seeking to get. Globally, if we look at the scenario, countries have been willing or they have been arm twisted by the vaccine manufacturing companies to give partial or complete liability. Developed countries like Canada, Singapore, United Kingdom, US, even the European Union, they have assumed a considerable amount of liability. So there has not been liability waiver for the vaccine manufacturers. Considerable amount of liability has been taken up by the central governments. US has a special law on this called as Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act. According to this 2005 legislation, the Health and Human Services Secretary can provide legal protection to companies making or distributing critical medical supplies, including vaccines. And US, in fact, has a dedicated compensation fund that will give the central government share of liability. But certain countries have assumed the full liability. For example, South African government has launched $250 million compensation fund for compensating its citizen in case of any eventuality out of vaccine usage. So this effectively waive off the liability of manufacturers. If we look at the constitutional provision, according to clause 4 of Article 294, the liability of the union government may arise out of any contract or otherwise. The liability of union government may arise. That means the union government may take the liability by the virtue of getting into contract with any agent, any manufacturer, any company. So if the government gets into any contract with any vaccine manufacturer, the government may be held liable. Since the manufacturer or the company will be working for the government, it will act as an agent. The procurement, the sale distribution, they all are governed by the policies of government. So government may take the liability of the entire process. This is what the Constitution states. The liability of the union government may arise out of any contract or otherwise. But presently, the state of affairs was such that the state meaning here country, or the central government, freed itself of all liability and shifted the liability to the vaccine manufacturers. So if looked from this vantage point, it is not very unreasonable thing to ask for after all. This article is from page number 7, The Economic Toolkit Revealed. This article has been written in the context of publication of RBI's annual report for the financial year 2020-2021. Based upon the analysis of this report, the article highlights that RBI has taken swift and timely actions to deal with the economic crisis caused by COVID-19 pandemic. But the efforts of RBI could yield only so much. So that must be complemented by the fiscal policy effort of Government of India. See, in order to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, RBI has really adopted adequate and timely expansionary monetary policy. RBI has reduced repo rate, reverse repo rate. RBI has tried its level best to inject liquidity in the economy through combination of both conventional and unconventional policy tools like repo operation, open market operation, reduction in repo rate. And you must have studied this in quite detail previously in the DNS and the Indian Express videos, targeted long-term repo operations and Operation Twist. RBI really has left no stone unturned to bring the economy back on track. But as it is said, the technique was right, but it just didn't work. On account of these policies taken by the RBI, the rate of interest on the loans given by the banks have also declined because RBI has injected liquidity in the economy. So banks have money. Monetary policy transmission has happened. And ideally, when there is a decline in the interest rate, that should lead to higher credit creation, leading to increase in investment and also in consumption expenditure, thus reducing the twin shock in the economy and bringing back the economy on track. But unfortunately, that has not happened. The decline in the interest rate has failed to translate into higher credit creation. And because of that, the last financial year had the lowest credit growth in last 10 years. This anomaly can be explained very well by the negative sentiment prevailing in the economy. On the supply side, the banks are sitting on surplus liquidity. They are reluctant to give loan on the fear of that being converted into NPA. So banks rather are preferring to park their surplus liquidity with the RBI itself using the reverse repo route. And on the demand side, both individuals and private sectors are very, very wary of uncertainty in the economy caused by the second wave and the anticipated third wave. So the poor sentiment, lack of animal spirit, that is causing lower demand for loans. So with all the effort, the RBI could not bring the economy back on track. So the toolkit revealed is the fiscal policy toolkit, and that must take precedence or that must support the monetary policy effort of RBI. The answer to yesterday's question of the day and today's question of the day is there on your screen. Please attempt the question, write your answer in the comment section, have some fruitful discussion, and also try to attempt the DNS quiz on our ELEARN platform. Thank you very much for spending your half an hour with me. Goodbye. Take care.